California is in a state of emergency. Find out why on Buzzsaw.
Central Intelligence Agency.
It was described by witnesses as
California's Governor Brown has just signed in $1 billion emergency drought package for the state, and apparently our water tables are only going to last another year. It's been a long time coming now with this drought getting worse and worse, but some people, for example, the LaRouche Political Action Committee, have been talking for a few years now about the North American Water and Power Administration, or Alliance, which actually President Kennedy had first proposed back in the early 60s. Ben Deniston is joining us today to talk about why we failed to implement that and what we can actually do to change course as far as altering our landscape and not sitting around waiting for the next rainfall. Let's enter the Buzzsaw. Ben, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Sean. Good to be here.
Absolutely. So I want to talk to you a little bit because, I mean, you guys have been talking about this North American Water and Power Alliance for a few years now, and obviously it goes back to the days of President Kennedy over 50 years ago. So here we are in California, which we know is an arid state. It's a lot of desert land, and yet we're surprised, for example, when droughts occur. And personally, I remember being a kid in the early 90s and having some pretty bad droughts in the state, and always thinking, well, why can't we be more proactive? And actually, as I'm a kid trying to say, like, how can we, ship rainwater to the coast, or how do we basically be proactive in taking, in tackling this drought? So let's start with the first question being, what are some measures that could be taken right now in the context of this emergency?
Well, I think really to begin to address it, we have to start talking about increasing the water supply. There's a lot of aspects we can get into on this whole situation, including indications that this drought might become the normal. There's actually studies that indicate that the water supply California has had over the past century, approximately, which is the water supply that we based all of our water systems on. I'll just add, I'm from California. I remember the droughts in the 90s. I remember being a kid, and I think I had a similar experience, letting the lawns die in the front yard and letting the grass go, and thinking, yeah, why can't we do something about this? The current drought now, it could keep going. There's no indication this is just going to be a short thing. There's a recent book that was released called The West Without Water by a professor of the University of California, Lynn Ingram. And they did studies indicating that showed that the climate for California on average over the past few thousand years was average generally much drier and also fluctuated a lot more. You'd get mega droughts, as they called them, that would last decades, if not longer. You'd get mega floods, where you'd get just an insane amount of water that could literally flood the entire Central Valley of California. So I think I want to premise the discussion by referencing this, because I think it's a really important thing to put up front when we're discussing how to approach this. The past century has been a pretty easygoing, relatively wetter, relatively stable century. So we have no basis to assume or believe or hope that we're just going to automatically return to the type of natural water availability, precipitation conditions that we had in the 20th century. It might come back, but there's no basis to assume that's going to be the case. So what I've been doing and working with Mr. LaRouche and our association for many years now, is saying, look, we got to increase the water supply. We have to bring new sources of water into California. There's been some important work that's been done over the past century, bringing some of the water from the Colorado River out to the west, managing the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers, the Central Valley Irrigation Project, the State Water Project. A lot of this was done in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and by the 60s, most of it was completed. And that's done a lot to create the conditions to make California, one of the most productive state in the whole country, producing a huge percentage of the food supply of the country. The Central Valley, Imperial Valley, these are bread baskets for the whole country. But the reason we were able to do that is because of the water management systems that we developed in the first half of the century. If we're going to maintain these systems and grow and continue to improve the economy, continue to be an expanding agricultural breadbasket to provide more jobs, we have to get new water in. Now, if we're going to, and especially if the climate's going to keep shifting towards longer drought, we can't just rely on the natural conditions.
Well, that's why, I mean, this is not really just a problem localized to California. This has really been addressed as a global issue, as so far as the notion of fresh water being a limited resource now is becoming a bigger issue in debates and discussions, right? And oftentimes people are trying to basically allege that it has to do with global warming or climate change is the motive behind, for example, a lot of our water tables becoming lower, for example, in certain areas. But the point is that this is a global issue now. As you said, we can't just sit there and depend upon the rains, or do a rain dance to bring it. We actually have to be more proactive in finding other ways of increasing the water supply.
From my work, I see three options to expand the water supply in the state, and beyond just California, throughout the West. One, desalination. In near San Diego and Carlsbad, California, they're just completing the largest desalination plant in the United States. It's relatively a drop in the bucket, but it demonstrates that the technologies exist to purify ocean water, create fresh water that can be used by mankind. To really do that is going to require going towards a more energy-intensive economy generally, driven by nuclear power and especially nuclear fusion. If we reached a nuclear fusion economy, which is not necessarily something we could do tomorrow or next year, but if we reached a level of nuclear fusion technologies, you could see mass-scale desalination because the energy would be much, much cheaper, and we could use it much more readily to desalinate ocean water. So desalination, and before fusion comes online, we can do it with fission systems. We can use nuclear fission technologies. We could start building some of the new designs for nuclear plants, which are incredibly safe, incredibly efficient, much more advanced than the current dinosaur plants that we have around the country today. And we could actually be moving forward and developing the immense potential of nuclear power and using that energy for desalination. So that's something that could be done, within a few years if you actually had a real crash program effort to do that. Another option, which gets a little more speculative, but I think it's worth putting on the table, and it's something I've been looking at, is directly affecting the condensation of water vapor through ionization systems. A form of weather modification, essentially. This has been tested and demonstrated in Australia, in Mexico. There's an ongoing program demonstrating this in Oman, in the Middle East. This has been used in the United Arab Emirates. There have been tests in Switzerland. There's been tests in Israel. And what these are systems, basically just towers connecting systems of wires where you run a certain precisely tuned electrical current through the wires, and you can you can modulate and alter the electrical properties of the atmosphere, something that already exists, but we can kind of slightly tap into it. And with these systems, you can actually help bring more moisture inland from over the oceans, and even induce moisture to condense into clouds and to rain. So you can actually, it's different than cloud seeding. This is not just dumping particles in the air. This is a way of beginning to tap into and modulate the electrical ionization properties of the atmosphere to facilitate condensation, cloud formation, and precipitation. So again, this is something that's, still a little bit not fully understood how to make it work to maybe to the degree we might need, but it's absolutely something we should be investigating, researching, testing, experimenting with, because if we could tap into the atmosphere, the moisture in the skies, we would solve many of the world water problems, not just in California, but in other places. And then real quick, just the third aspect in terms of bringing new water into California is what you had mentioned, this NAWAPA design, the North American Water and Power Alliance. And we can get into all of these things in more detail, but very briefly, this was a design to bring a small percentage of the freshwater runoff from British Columbia, Yukon Territory, and Alaska down through the Rocky Mountains up onto the Great Basin, where Utah, the states up there desperately need water as well, and then bring the water all the way down into California, and then throughout the whole Southwest, California stretching over to Texas and into northern Mexico. Bring some water to Mexico, help them develop greater agriculture and address their water needs as well. So this was a program that was designed in detail, ready to be developed and go, like you said, around the time of Kennedy, and certainly would have addressed the current situation easily if it had been developed and implemented at the time. But now it would certainly take, upwards of 15 years to start to get the first water running. So it's not exactly a short-term solution, but it's certainly a longer-term program that would be needed to improve the water cycle of the entire Southwest. This is something that, for example, bringing this water down, you could plug it into the Colorado River. Right now the Colorado River gets completely tapped before it reaches the ocean, so it actually runs dry. The river doesn't even run into the ocean most of the time. With this NAWAPA system, there'd be plenty of water, and you could make the Colorado River run vigorously back into the ocean again. We wouldn't have to be tapping these rivers to the last drop. We could create a robust, sustainable cycle. And again, this is not just taking some finite supply. The water is constantly being deposited up in the north. The precipitation there is immense. You're constantly getting significant rainfall, snowpack up in the Alaska, northern, northwest Canada region. So the water is there. Most of it just runs very quickly back into the ocean before even really participating in any activity on land much.
So it sounds like
what NAWAPA would do is just redirect a small percentage of this water down into the Southwest, allow it to be used by plant life, by the biosphere, by human economic activity, and then let it cycle back into the ocean again to complete the cycle. So it'd really be like augmenting the cycle to increase its productivity. So
right.
That's a third option for bringing new water to the West.
So it sounds like NAWAPA is basically proposing that rather than a Keystone oil pipeline, we're actually talking about a Keystone water pipeline coming from Alaska.
Yeah, and then most of it wouldn't even have to be pipelines. It could be you can use existing rivers. You can build certain canals. A lot of the bulk of it is using existing rivers. This can create, some of the work we did in speaking to, leaders of Western states about this project, they're also excited about the types of recreation and development you could create with these reservoirs. Types of the reservoirs along the project could be places for, new towns, new cities, new development. It wouldn't just have to be a pipe running through nothing. It can be a whole process of development and growth and developing these territories where, frankly, there's not a whole lot of activity in a lot of these places.
Right. But the point being that it's unfortunate that our politicians are so much more obsessed with oil as their lifeblood as opposed to water as their lifeblood, and more focused upon moving oil down as opposed, and natural gas as opposed to moving, water and redirecting it to the Midwest and the Western states, as you talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other question, obviously, is regarding the desalination desalination plants. Are there successful desalination plants that are currently deployed in the world, aside from the one you just mentioned that was opened recently in California?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The biggest location is the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has a few plants, a number of plants, the largest of which are significantly larger. I don't have the figures in front of me, but they're something on the range of 5 times larger than the one just being completed in Carlsbad, California. Israel has a few operations, and they just completed a relatively new facility, which is highly efficient, in the range of the efficiency of the one just completed in Carlsbad, California, but also significantly bigger. It's used all the time for smaller operations, small resorts that are isolated, but island resorts or something where they don't have big fresh water supply. They'll just desalinate, a small amount of water for their needs. Cruise ships, military ships. So the technology is absolutely there. The main issue is increasing the efficiency, so you lower the energy requirements to make it happen. But more importantly, increasing the energy available to our economy generally, so we can afford things like this. Increasing what my boss, Mr. LaRouche, calls the energy flux density of the economy. So we can, this is something maybe we can get into, but this is kind of typical of what mankind uniquely does that makes mankind different than an animal species. We are not, by our nature, we're not limited to any finite number of resources or sources of resources. Through scientific and technological revolutions, associated with increasing energy flux density, we can turn things that used to be worthless to us into resources. Right now, desalination is kind of, it's viewed as an expensive, energy-intensive method for using water. If we went to a nuclear economy, and if we pursued developing nuclear power on a large scale, and if we pursued fusion, like my boss was in the middle of in the 1980s, pursuing fusion power and fusion technologies, we would easily be able to afford desalination in large scales.
Right. So what kind of scale are you talking about in terms of the production of these desalination plants, like the one in Carlsbad you mentioned? I mean, is it going to be enough to service, a few thousand people, or 100,000 people, 1 million people? Do you know what kind of scale you're talking about for this?
Yeah, plant? That's a good question. I didn't pull the specific figures. I believe the Carlsbad plant would is going to provide water for something on the range of like 5 to 15% of San Diego County. Maybe San Diego City, don't quote me on the specifics, but it's in that range. Mm-hmm. So it's not massive, it's not huge, but it's a significant help to that region. We would obviously need things much bigger. And speaking to California, obviously a huge issue is agriculture. This is a very, very important agricultural region, and there's some of the people that have been getting hit the biggest. The headlines now are that California is going to run out of water in a year. Well, for the farmers, they already ran out of water. The water being allocated to the farmers has been slashed to nothing. Mm-hmm. In a number of cases. There's towns in Central California where they literally they turn on the faucet and the water does not come out. That's already happening.
Well, in the context of this kind of situation, aren't there sort of like drought-resistant seeds and things of this sort that would basically allow them to keep growing, even with a much lower amount of water available to them, to the farmers? Yeah,
I'm not an expert on all that, but I believe that type of stuff is being investigated and developed. Some of the discussion is shifting to crops that are that require less water in general. Certainly. Developing seeds that would require less water, I believe, is something that is being pursued, and it certainly would be helpful. And I think, obviously, given the immediacy of the situation, a lot of things like that are going to need to be employed for the very short term. Better rationing, better reuse of existing water, more efficient use. We're certainly going to need to do as much as possible to best utilize the existing supply in the immediate period. But if we're going to be serious, we got to take up the issue that Mr. LaRouche and my associates have been putting on the table for the past years now. We have to increase the water supply. We got to look at these new ways of bringing more water into the system in California.
Yeah. Well, speaking of NAWAPA, for example, and we mentioned earlier that Kennedy proposed this 50 years ago. What kind of political opposition has there been? I mean, we would think it's insane to object or oppose, such an initiative, and yet it was never put through. I mean, so what kind of political resistance has there been, and what have you guys encountered, obviously, in the course of your advocacy for NAWAPA, for example, for the last 5 years or so?
I think that really gets to the heart of the issue, because to really get at this, it's not just water. I mean, water's one expression, but we have our infrastructure, our transportation systems, our bridges, our roads. We've been just riding for the past 40, 50 years on a decaying economy. And the economy's been shifting more and more towards this idea of making money on Wall Street, making money in Silicon Valley, and shifting away from a physical orientation towards industry, towards agriculture, towards infrastructure. So I really think that the issue with the water is, as you're raising it, is an expression of a more general shift that the nation went through, really starting in the late 60s and the early 70s, a shift towards a post-industrial economy, as it was literally called by some people. And the idea that we don't need to keep investing in these things. Another aspect of this shift that occurred, which is I think a big issue that we have to tackle, is the real origin of what people identify as the green movement. Now I'm all for healthy, clean environments. I don't want to be breathing, completely soot-filled air or drinking disgusting water, or I'm completely in favor of ensuring you have a nice, healthy biosphere, healthy environment you're working in. But there is a religious-like devotion among a certain section of the population to the idea that anything mankind does is bad or unnatural, and that we shouldn't do anything to affect the environment. And that is really a suicidal ideology. And there's a certain history to it, which we can get into, which is I think very important. But a lot of kind of these hardcore ideas about removing human influence from the environment completely come out of the real founders of the so-called environmentalist movement, which were basically just the leaders of the eugenics movement. The people who founded the World Wildlife Fund, for example, which is one of the top environmental organizations, which has huge influence and has had huge influence shaping environmental policy. The people who founded that were Prince Philip, the husband, the royal consort to the Queen of England, Prince Bernhard, who was literally a member of the Nazi Party in the 1930s. He was a prince of the Netherlands. Julian Huxley, who was the head of the British Eugenics Society after World War II, a major eugenics proponent. Prince Philip himself has stated openly that he believes that the world is way overpopulated. We need to reduce the human population. And he's openly spoken about killing off sections of the population. So, this might seem like a leap that I'm going through all this right now, but this is what has come into the policy of the United States. This idea that what these people have pushed based on their own eugenics, population reduction, really oligarchical ideology, has been this hardcore environmental idea, which basically says, anything mankind does is bad. We have to reduce our impact on the planet. We have to reduce our consumption. We have to reduce our population. We have to reduce everything. And it's really a suicidal mentality. And that's been a lot of kind of the cultural counterpoint to these proposals like NAWAPA.
Right. Well, I was going to mention just Prince Philip said, for example, that he wanted to come back as a virus in his next incarnation, so he could, just kill as many humans as possible, because it goes into that whole mentality of genocide.
He said that twice.
Yeah. So the point.
You think being caught on record saying that once was enough, but he said that twice on record.
Right, because these people are very fanatical about this whole notion, again, of overpopulation, and really what I think boils down to the term conservation, right, or the idea of zero growth, or what's oftentimes labeled as sort of sustainable growth, right? And sustainable growth can be, that's a term that can make sense, but again, it depends on how you implement it. If you want sustainable growth to really mean no growth or zero growth as far as industry and development is concerned, you're ultimately creating conditions like we're now seeing for potential genocidal, not necessarily genocidal, but sort of a reduction of the population, let's say. For example, if California keeps on this trajectory, as we're now seeing, right, where you have a tremendous population, perhaps Los Angeles is overpopulated as far as the city is concerned, because again, overpopulation has everything to do with the area you're talking about, the population, in terms of a certain area, a fixed area. Los Angeles City and county may be overpopulated. It has not perhaps made the proper investments into infrastructure and to accommodate this huge population in this area. Mm-hmm. But now we're looking at a situation of a drought that's going to potentially force people to either move away or find some other, again, unless we actually make these investments that you're discussing here, you're describing here, if we actually don't make these changes, I don't see how we can continue to live en masse in a state that has such a limited amount of water.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the reality people are increasingly forced to deal with now, and I think that's why we have to be, now's the time to speak out and say, look, mankind, our mission on this planet is to improve things, is to improve the conditions. I think NAWAPA, is an excellent example of that. We can actually, if you really want green, if you're for green, if you're for, more green, then you'd want to do NAWAPA. You'd want to bring water into these desert regions and increase the plant life, increase the productivity of the land, increase the wildlife that can exist there. You'd want to, I've done some studies on this. The whole thing with water is that you're dealing with a cycle, right? It comes from the ocean, it comes into the atmosphere, it falls over land, and it returns to the ocean. And that's what's going on the whole west coast of the United States, up to Alaska. It just so happens that most of the water falls far up north, and it falls right along the coastline, along these mountains, and flows right back into the ocean. So why not divert some of that, bring it down to the southwest, increase the productivity of that whole region, in terms of life, the biosphere, and in terms of human activity, and then let the water cycle back out again. What's so terrible about that idea that people would refuse to go with it?
Yeah.
This is the expression of mankind as a positive force that can increase the usefulness of the land, the productivity of the land, and create growth in that way. That's what mankind naturally does. And that's, in more general terms, what we've turned away from as a country over the past, 2 generations now.
Yeah, well, it would be unfortunate to see California become desertified in ways, for example, that we know North Africa, for example, where was desertified as a course of climate change, right? We know Egypt at one point was not only swamp but had a lot of plant life and was much more fertile than it became. So it's a question of, are we going to sit there as humans and simply let the climate change that is inevitable drive us out of this place, out of California, or are we going to actually, as you say, be a productive force and alter our landscape for the better of not only of our own conditions, but for all of all life in this region? Yeah,
absolutely. And another example, kind of jumping around here, but I think another example, just to throw in this direction of discussion. I was fascinated that recent studies showed that significant portions of the Amazon rainforest were a product of early human activity. That we think of this lush, productive rainforest. Frankly, a lot of that's not natural. A lot of that's a product of the fact that much earlier civilizations there had cultivated the land. They developed irrigation systems. They'd done certain controlled burnings to improve the nutrients in the soil. So the Amazon rainforest, as we picture it now, has been shaped by the useful activity of mankind. And just to kind of throw a fun example in there, but yeah, like you're saying, the climate's always shifting. This is another aspect to throw in there. You mentioned it earlier that a lot of people are saying, well, this is man-made global warming. That's what's doing this. Obama said that. Obama, the president of the United States, came out and when he spoke in California, asserted that this is the drought is a product of man-made climate change. Now that was so ridiculous that even the New York Times featured an article refuting that, and they had to say, well, if we're just being honest, our climate models show that if there's warming, California should get wetter in the wintertime when most of the snowpack and precipitation comes. But so by the climate change models that they're dealing with, the general idea is that, well, if the earth is warming, California should get wetter. Here's Obama, the president of the United States, and he just spews these lies. They're so ridiculous that even the environmentalists themselves have to come out and say, well, that's actually not true. You shouldn't be saying that because that's not even what our models say. But it's just this idea that's being promoted that any climate change is somehow an effect of mankind's inherently negative action on the planet. It's just another expression of this insane ideology. And just to throw it in there, the planet hasn't been warming for over 18 years now. So this whole climate change discussion is just ridiculous. And the idea, the anthropogenic, the man-made climate change idea is, ridiculous. And then for people to claim that the shifting precipitation and the drought in California is a product of man's activity is ludicrous. It's, as I cited in the beginning, the climate, the records in California show that this past century has been anomalously wet. It's been above average in terms of precipitation. And the natural trend, just by letting nature run its course, is we would expect towards moving towards something where it's generally drier. Maybe with droughts and then wet periods back and forth, but overall moving in a direction that would be with less water for the region. So to claim that this is the effect of man's activity is nuts. But yeah. I think the point that we should really be taking up as a nation right now is back to this issue that, so the climate's going to be changing. We're not really going to be able to control that. What we can do is, ensure that we improve the conditions of the land, in the West and in other parts of the world, and view mankind as a good, productive force on the planet.
It may, as you said, it may be ludicrous to claim that the drought is being caused by man's activity, but it's even more ludicrous to let our inactivity continue this drought.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Ben, and giving us, your insights into some of the ways that we can actually be proactive in overturning this pattern. And I think definitely, you guys got to keep pushing on this NAWAPA thing, and obviously, more importantly, the CRASH program with desalination and nuclear fusion, hopefully to help that process along.
Yeah, and people can find more info on our website, larouchepac.com. LAROUCHEPAC.com. And we've got more information on the NAWAPA project, on desalination, on this weather modification potentials to stimulate more rainfall.
Yeah.
So I highly encourage people to get that information and circulate and get some real discussion going on what, as you're saying, Sean, what we can do as a proactive force.
Absolutely.
To improve things instead of just sitting back and letting hell come down around us.
Well, it all begins by raising awareness. So thanks for joining us and speaking with us today, Ben.
Sure, thank you.
Have a good one. Well, there you have it, folks. Don't be fooled by the old gods of the old days that would tell you that this drought has been brought upon by your own cursed behavior. No, the only thing that's bringing this drought on is our own lack of behavior, lack of forethought and initiative to actually address these problems before they arrive. So now that we're in it, let's start the discussion again, and let's start pushing the scientific envelope forward such that we can properly address it before California ends up completely desertified and not as hospitable for human life. This is Sean Stone signing off.